Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. We're excited to speak to you today and provide an overview of the Florida Pathways Institute application. My name is Katora Young, and I serve as the program analyst for the Florida Student Success Center, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Carrie Henderson, who serves as the Executive Vice Chancellor for the Florida College System. Okay, so we're just going to go over the logistics for the webinar today before we get started. Participants will be on mute for the duration of the webinar, and if you check over in the handouts pane, materials from today's webinar are available there. So the PDF of the PowerPoint is there and 2 other handouts. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so you can submit your questions in the questions section as well. Please note that this webinar will be recorded. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Henderson.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Florida Student Success Center webinar on the Florida Pathways Institute. So many of you are familiar with the Student Success Center. We were founded in 2018 with a generosity from the Helios Education Foundation. And as the Student Success Center grows and matures, the next big thing for the Student Success Center is the Florida Pathways Institute. And so today's webinar is really to provide you an overview of FPI, what the service delivery model is going to be, what the institutional commitment is going to be if your institution wants to become a Pathways institution. We're also going to spend a little bit of time going over the components to the application that is now out. And as Katura mentioned, a copy of the application is in your handouts pane if you would like to download it. We're going to go over the timeline for the Florida Pathways Institute, both the timeline for the application process as well as the timeline for becoming a cohort institution. And then we are going to answer any questions that you might have at the close of the webinar. Please know that you can submit questions along the way, but we will get to all questions by the end of the webinar. So as we get started with an overview of the Florida Pathways Institute, many of you probably were connected to the Florida Student Success Center this past year, or hopefully have at least heard about Mathematics Pathways Redesign as a primary focus for the Student Success Center in its first year. That was an effort that continues to be strong and continues to be a huge part of what the Florida Student Success Center is and does. And as we think about the Student Success Center growing and serving all of our institutions, we are going to be creating a program called Florida Pathways. And so you might ask yourself, what is Florida Pathways? It is a statewide guided pathways implementation effort, which is really designed to scale guided pathways across the Florida college system, ultimately with the goal of helping students complete and improving their social and economic mobility for graduates. We are aware many institutions are implementing facets of guided pathways, and so building on what institutions have already done. And we are modeling our program on the American Association of Community Colleges Pathways Project. We do have 4 Florida College System institutions who were part of Pathways before, and I know Pathways 3.0 is happening as well, so we might have Florida College System institutions continue to be involved with the AACC program. But the Florida Pathways Institute is the only Pathways Institute for Florida College System institutions specifically. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Before we get to the Institute, why guided pathways? Why does the Student Success Center look to guided pathways as an important initiative to create the Pathways Institute? And so looking back on the years of implementation and digging into the data, digging into the research, when we look at community college student outcomes, we've been able to identify through groups like the Community College Research Center why those particular models led to poor student outcomes. So some examples of that might be having institutions that have a cafeteria style model where students come in and are given a menu of course offerings and a menu of services, and they guide themselves towards what course they might want to take based on what the description is in the catalog, and they might choose to take advantage of one service but not another. And so that cafeteria model can sometimes leave students sort of floating and not on a pathway that is what is they should be on for success. Additionally, what we found through the literature is disjointed support services. So thinking about silos within institutions and recognizing that a student experiences one institution doesn't necessarily understand the difference between different units or different departments. And so thinking about how student support services can support the student on the academic side, so making sure that they have adequate tutoring, library and learning resources, and academic support services, coupled with more holistic advising support services that help students choose a pathway to enter and supports them all along the pathway. So thinking about needs that a student might have outside of the classroom, that more holistic approach to student support. And then lastly, looking at isolated interventions. And so we hear a lot about boutique programs or programs that serve a certain population of students for a certain period of time. And when you look at those boutique programs, you're not necessarily achieving scale, so serving a large majority of students. And when you also isolate interventions, thinking about the scope of the effect that you might have, it could be limited. And so why guided pathways? The idea is that to increase student outcomes, we need to move away from the traditional model where students had a cafeteria approach. Their support services were disjointed, and there might be interventions that are more on an isolated basis, and move toward a more guided pathway so that students feel supported all along the way from beginning to enter through their college experience and well into their classroom. So what is Guided Pathways? Guided Pathways is an integrated institution-wide approach to student success, and it's really grounded foundationally in giving students a clear pathway or a clear roadmap to support and guide them efficiently from when they enter to when they complete and whatever their post-completion outcome is, be it employment or transfer to another institution. And so the point that we want to iterate, and I think it's a point that we've heard from existing pathways institutions, is that Guided Pathways is not an initiative. It's not a one-time effort to adopt something and then move on to the next thing. We hear a lot from institutions about initiative fatigue, and we tried this particular intervention 5 years ago, and now you're asking us to do this, and what has changed within that period of time? So we really want to reframe the conversation around guided pathways to it not being something that an institution does and then goes back to what it did before, but rather Guided Pathways is a holistic approach for community colleges, universities to really become centered on students and what students need to have a clear point of entry and to be successful in whatever their ultimate goal is. And so when we think about it in those terms, Guided Pathways is a leadership-led culture shift, but it also requires support from the ground up and significant institutional investment to support institutional change. And so when we look at the national model of Guided Pathways, it really is a multi-year effort that includes a number of different components. So it's not one thing, it's a series and a collection of interventions that really are designed to transform an institution. The 4 pillars of Guided Pathways that you can see on your screen was developed by the Community College Research Center, who's a partnership with us as the Florida Student Success Center, in conjunction with what was learned from AACC and the Pathways Project. And so the first pillar of Guided Pathways is to create clear curricular pathways to employment and further education. Within Florida, certainly we have a number of existing policy levers like meta-major academic pathways, where institutions have started to think along the lines of career curricular pathways. What Guided Pathways will look to do is take the meta-major concept and make it even more granular so that students that enter post-secondary institution identify what their goal is. Do they want to get a job, or do they plan on transferring? And then based on the program that the student enrolls in, the student would then receive some sort of program map or pathway that shows them the steps they need to take to ultimately earn that credential and go on to whatever their end goal is. And so one of the first pillars of guided pathway that our institute colleges will do is look at curricular mapping and look at program mapping and think from a student's perspective, what is the appropriate sequence of courses they need to take in order to be most successful along their pathway. The second pillar of guided pathways is to help students choose and enter their pathway. So really thinking about admissions and career assessment, giving students access to resources that they might need to take a career assessment and understand all of the opportunities that are afforded to them through our institutions. And then also having them reflect on what their strengths are and what their interests are, and identifying what the pathway is that they want to embark on that's going to help them be most successful with their goals. The third pillar is to help students stay on their path. So really thinking not only about retention, but productive persistence, making sure that students not only have the academic support, the support in the classroom to be successful as they move forward, but that there is consistent advising and intrusive advising and support all along the way, so that the student experience is one that helps them understand how to get from A to B, and removing barriers that they might face along the way. And then the last pillar of guided pathways, the fourth one, is to ensure that learning is happening with an intentional outcome. And so, of course, our institutions are all measuring learning outcomes. What guided pathways seeks to do is to really reinforce the notion of having these clear roadmaps and supporting students and aligning courses and learning outcomes with what a student's intended goal is. And so going through the guided pathway process and going through the first of the three pillars culminates in this last piece, which is ensure that learning is happening with intentional outcomes. And so when you think about the Guided Pathways Institute model, or just guided pathways more generally, I think it's fair to say that it really does require an entire institution, from academic affairs, certainly, student affairs, workforce, business officers, institutional research. So the implementation and planning for guided pathways is something that does require an entire institution working toward a shared goal. So now that we've laid the framework for why guided pathways and what is guided pathways, I'd like to transition to talk through what our service model is going to be for SPI. So SPI is going to consist of a cohort of colleges that are going to be dedicated to guided pathways work. The cohort is going to span a period of 2 years and include a number of activities that I'll explain in a moment. So the idea behind SPI is to use a cohort approach to help us organize the services, but also to help the institutions who are participating in SPI. There is nothing like sharing information, sharing practices with colleagues who are going through a similar experience. And so we're very excited about having this cohort model, so that as institutions within the Florida college system are engaging with their own pathways efforts, you also have the support and the expertise of other institutions who might be in a similar place and might have guidance and support for you along your journey. So as a Pathways Institute, we first will be administering what is known as the Scale of Adoption Assessment in fall of 2019. So the Scale of Adoption Assessment was created by CCRC, Community College Research Center, as a way for institutions to take the temperature of where they are in implementing the 4 pillars of guided pathways. Our intention is to use this almost as a diagnostic tool, so that institutions who are interested perhaps in joining the cohort have an opportunity to really have candid conversations on their campuses about where their institution is as it relates to implementing the different pillars of guided pathways. The Scale of Adoption Assessment is something that's publicly available, and we will be using the version that CCRC has piloted and used across a number of states and a number of student success centers. We likely will make some customized selections for the state of Florida. Again, given where we are in terms of policy, we want to make sure that the FPI model is taking the best of what the AACC model has done and making it custom to the Florida college system. So what our plan is to, for institutions who say, you know, yes, I think I want to go on this journey to implement guided pathways. The first thing that those institutions will be asked to do is to implement the Scale of Adoption Assessment. So it's an assessment that would go out electronically via survey, and it would essentially assess where the institution is and its capacity to implement guided pathways. And so we really see that as the first step in becoming one of the FPI institutions as part of our cohort. And it's also a good step to assess where your institution is with pathways implementation. We do anticipate that the Scale of Adoption Assessment and part of our guidance to institutions who choose to participate will be making sure that those who complete the assessment represent a large representative group of stakeholders across the institution. So it's not just one or two people completing the Scale of Adoption Assessment. We're getting results and feedback from faculty members, from academic affairs, student affairs, all walks of the college, so that we can really get a temperature read on where the institution is with the different implementation efforts. The other thing to note about the Scale of Adoption Assessment is it's something that will have institutions use along the way to measure progress over time. So it's going to be a great resource for institutions getting started in this work, but also institutions who are going through this journey with us to measure their progress over time. The second piece of our service delivery model is a face-to-face convening model. We know the value of getting people in a room to talk to each other, to talk to experts, to do planning, and to share in ways that institutions can think about implementing guided pathways. And so we do anticipate a series of 4 face-to-face convenings that are likely going to be over that 2-year period, 2 days. So pretty intensive convenings that will involve a set of pre-work that institutions are asked to do, so that when your team comes to the convenings that we have or the institutes that we have, you are ready to dive into planning. You're ready to work with coaches about, you know, what the steps are that you need to take to implement program mapping, not only for full-time or part-time students, that sort of thing. And so we see this face-to-face gathering as being really critical in the implementation of our service delivery model, and a great opportunity not only for people within an institution to come together focused solely on this, but also share with your colleagues across the state in your efforts. We also, as part of our service delivery model, colleges are going to receive coaching, technical assistance, and support related to guided pathways implementation. We do have a set of coaches who have been trained through Achieving the Dream and Jobs for the Future in guided pathways implementation. And we anticipate that each college will be assigned at least one coach who will be their accountability partner, their cheerleader, but also lead them through somewhat difficult conversations around implementation and having those courageous conversations about what it means to be a pathways institution, to look at data, to look at issues of equity, and ultimately to move toward a more student-centered approach. Technical assistance, of course, in addition to the coaching, is a big component. And so there are various aspects of technical assistance that we anticipate either providing directly or connecting colleges with. So especially areas related around data capacity and other areas related to guided pathways implementation. And then Florida Pathways Institute cohort colleges also have an opportunity to participate in the post-secondary data partnership. So this is a relatively new endeavor that is organized with the National Student Clearinghouse and the State Higher Ed Executive Officers Organization to create a more robust tool to collect and report data on student-level outcomes that is at a deeper level of disaggregation than what you might get through IPEDS. And so as part of the Florida Pathways Institute, colleges can participate in the Post-Secondary Data Partnership as a way to increase their capacity to analyze these data and hopefully start to think about benchmarking and targeting interventions to positively impact students. So what is the commitment from colleges? So this is our first cohort of institutions, and so we're really excited to take what we've learned by looking at what other states and other student success centers have done and apply it to the Florida college system. And so we expect that cohort colleges will maintain participation over the 2-year period. We think that that is really important, that the folks who start this work will go throughout the full process with us of the multiple convenings, the coaching, the technical assistance, and commit to that 2-year time period of engaging in guided pathways work. I will say, with that being said, that guided pathways implementation can take upwards of 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And so we really see that 2-year period as an opportunity to ignite interest and create a sense of urgency. We also recognize that 2 years is not the entire lifespan of guided pathways implementation. And so this really is 2 years setting up the foundation for full-scale implementation. We will ask that each college identify a team for the Florida Pathways Institute of 6 to 10 representatives. And so these are going to be the teams who are working on various components of implementation. And we would ask that those representatives attend the face-to-face convenings that we are organizing. And as I said, we're planning to have 4 2-day convenings over a 2-year time period. And so that's what you can expect minimally. We may look at creating regional convenings as well as opportunities arise to do deeper dives into particular topics that emerge. As I said earlier, we do anticipate that there will be assignments or homework, if you will, before and after the convening to ensure that institutions are on track and meeting their goals when it comes to implementation of the work. We also are looking and have an expectation that there will be virtual meetings or check-in calls with coaches or Student Success Center staff just to hold folks accountable as the work moves forward. And then, of course, connecting with Pathways coaches is going to be a big part of what we expect institutions to do. So right now, cohort colleges can expect to cover the cost of travel however your institution defines it, whether it be hotel, rental car, per diem, for college representatives to attend the face-to-face convenings in Florida. So again, colleges can expect to cover the cost of travel, and we anticipate it'll be 6 to 10 representatives, again, for convenings over a 2-year period. We are hard at work in seeking additional funding for the Pathways Institute. So our goal and our commitment to you is to do our best to try to be in a place where we can offer the Pathways Institute free of charge for institutions. Our goal is to democratize guided pathways, if you will. We really want to make sure that institutions who might not have been able to participate in AACC or any other Pathways Institute is able to do so at no cost or minimally at low cost. And so we are hard at work at securing those funding resources, and we anticipate that by January or February of next year, so spring of 2020, we will be able to tell colleges what you can expect in terms of fee for service. So before your institution officially commits to anything, you will know and be able to make a decision based on whether or not there's going to be a fee for service. And Similarly, just because you submit an application and just because you participate in the scale of adoption assessment doesn't commit you necessarily. We are going to be seeking and affirming a commitment in the spring of 2020. We recognize institutions can be at different places, and you might think this semester this makes sense for our institution, depending on hurricanes, natural disasters, ERP implementations. There might be various reasons why an institution between September, which is when that application is due, and the spring, which is when we are asking for a formal commitment, there might be reasons why you can't participate. And so know that by submitting an application, we will ask you to reaffirm that commitment in the spring in case anything has come up in the intermediate time. So now let's talk about the components of the application. So as I said earlier, the handouts pane includes a Word version of the application, which is available for download. And we ask that you use this template as you complete your application. So the components of the application are just some basic institutional information, who the primary contacts are for the application, a series of narrative questions, which is the bulk of the application, and then a signature from the president affirming that the institution would like to participate in guided pathways. So with the narrative questions, we have a series of 7 questions that we've included as part of the application process. And part of asking these questions isn't so much for our benefit. Certainly, we would like a sense of where your institutions are with implementation and why the time is right for you now. But we really would like your campuses to start having these conversations locally about your readiness to implement guided pathways. And so we think that by going through these series of questions, your institution can begin or continue a conversation around guided pathways. So really, while this is going to be useful for us to track who is going to participate in pathways, it's also intended to be a useful exercise for you all as you complete the application and think about what it means to be a pathways institution. So we do ask you to provide a brief description of any student success initiatives that are currently underway. So these are kind of the bigger initiatives that are defining your institutions. And bullets are fine here. It doesn't have to be too much text. But again, kind of what are the big student success efforts that are underway at your institution? We do want you to reflect on why is your institution ready now to begin guided pathways work or continue guided pathways work if your institution has implemented components of it before. Asking you to reflect on the role of the president and your senior leadership team, your cabinet, and what role do they currently play in efforts related to improving student learning and improving student completion at your college? How are you currently engaging stakeholders at all levels in improving student outcomes? As we said at the top of the call, this really is large-scale institutional change, and so it is something that over time is going to involve a number of different stakeholders across the institution. So reflecting on how you do that already, whether it be through shared governance or some other way, some council for engagement. We do ask you with number 5 to reflect on use of data to inform student success efforts. What is your current practice related to that? What barriers do you foresee to successfully implementing guided pathways? As you probably have heard if you've talked to any institutions that have done this work, it is difficult work, and it's something that really does require persistence and a reminder about the focus that is needed to maintain the momentum around guided pathways. And so thinking about not only the positive, which is what you'll stand to benefit from participating in SCI, we also want you to think about what are some barriers that your institution might have with successful implementation, and having those real conversations at your campus we think is beneficial before you begin the process. And then lastly, what do you hope to gain from being part of it? we assume certainly learning more about guided pathways and implementing guided pathways. This is really an opportunity with question 7 for you to tell us what it is that is particularly of interest to you. We are taking the curriculum that AACC has developed and worked over time with institutions, and we are customizing it for Florida. And so we're able to build on some of the mathematics work that we've engaged in. We're able to look at some of the questions around articulation a little different because of our articulation system, because of our common course numbering. And so as you reflect on your campus about SPI, we also want you to share with us what is it that you hope to gain from this, and what is a value that we could bring as a Student Success Center to the work that you do through the Pathways Institute. So we really see that question 7 not only as an opportunity for you to share what you hope to get out of it, and that helps us know, but it's also a way for you to provide us with information so that as we're building our curriculum and going through the process, we can make sure that it's tailored to what our institutions that are participating are interested in learning. So in terms of the timeline, our deadline for the FPI application is September 1st of this year. So colleges are expected to submit the full SPI application with the president's signature by September 1st. What we're going to be doing with all of the institutions that submitted an application is connecting with them about administering the scale of adoption assessment in the fall term. And so that will include setting up a survey instrument that has the scale of adoption assessment and coming up with a plan for disseminating those results, those survey questions, and then how you're going to assess where your institution is related to guided pathways. And so October, November is a time period that we will be looking to set up what are known as calibration calls. So those are calls where we reflect with institutional leaders on the results from the scale of adoption assessment, and with our coaches, ask you to think about, your institution rated this particular facet of guided pathways as something that you're implementing at scale. When we look at your supporting documentation, we didn't see evidence of that, and really challenging you to think through where your institution is in these different areas and get a real thorough assessment of a baseline of where your institutions are. So the fall term, again, is really for implementation of scale of adoption assessment and an institutional reflection of it for the colleges that submit the SPI application. And then by January, February, we'll ask colleges to reflect on the results of the assessment, to reflect on where your institution is, to think about the service delivery model and whether it will be a fee for service, and if that's something your institution can budget for or not. Again, our hope is that this will be free of charge for institutions to participate. But we'll ask you by February of 2020 if you want to commit to being a cohort institution. And so if you say yes, we'll move forward and have you participate in the full cohort experience, looking to kick off in summer or fall 2020. And if your institution decides at that point or any point in time, now isn't the right time, we do anticipate that there will be multiple cohorts moving forward. So we don't know the duration or the frequency, but we do anticipate likely in 2022, once we've had a full cohort under our belt, we will be starting the second cohort of SPI institutions. So this isn't a one-time opportunity. We're looking to make this something that institutions can participate in at a time that makes sense for them. So that concludes the comments that we prepared. And so if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them through the question pane. We did get one that came in, and so I'll share that as other folks are typing in. And so the question we received is how many colleges will be selected to participate in the cohort? And so our hope is that for the first cohort, because this is our first time, we'll have a smaller handful of institutions, so 4 to 6. We right now don't have a sense of how many institutions want to participate and don't want to turn any institution away. So when you exit the survey, you will actually be asked, do you think your institution is going to participate? And it's not something firmly committing to, but we do want to get a sense of who's going to participate so that we can plan our resources accordingly. So again, our hope would be to have a smaller group of institutions for this first cohort, but then looking to expand it as we move forward with additional colleges coming on board. A question about if the September 1st deadline, is there an opportunity to revisit? I think if your institution is worried about hitting that September 1st deadline, we will absolutely work with you on looking at an extension. And so just email us and we'll work to do that. The September deadline is there because we do want to start administering the scale of adoption assessment on your campuses, likely in late September, early October. So we will need to know pretty early into September which institutions want to be part of the scale of adoption assessment. But if you need a week extension, 2-week extensions, definitely connect with us and we'll work with you. Questions about how four-year universities are going to be included in this plan. Right now, this is exclusive to the Florida college system, and we anticipate that the cohort institutions will remain Florida college system institutions. That being said, a lot of the conversations around guided pathways, especially when we think about program maps, when we think about transfer, universities have to be part of those conversations. And so we do anticipate locally engaging in conversations around transfer and pathways. But there might be opportunities too with our face-to-face convenings to involve the university system more broadly, because of course the transfer component is so important to the work that we do. So a question about colleges that were part of the National AACC Pathways Institute. Is there a plan or an expectation to involve these colleges in some capacity, be it coaching or support? I will tell you that we do have college coaches. We have 3 right now, and 2 are from Pathways institutions. And we do hope to draw on the experience of the Pathways institutions, and we'll be reaching out to leadership within those institutions moving forward. We do want to be mindful, though, that we're also providing a value to those institutions, because you can have been part of this national initiative, but maybe you want to revisit a component of it. And so we would like to engage in a dialogue with any institution that's been part of AACC, so we can learn from them, but we also want to make sure that the Student Success Center, our model for service delivery, also provides value to those institutions. So I don't think there's necessarily a formal expectation that they be involved. I think there's a hope that we could learn from each other and work together so that the institutions who are part of the cohort are able to draw on the experiences from their predecessors. A question about what makes an institution a good candidate for participation in the cohort. I would actually kind of turn that question around more on the institutions. And I think you as an institutional leader need to think about why is the time right for my institution to implement guided pathways or the components of guided pathways. From our perspective, in terms of the cohort, our interest is making sure that, one, institutions understand that this isn't a one-and-done initiative, that they understand that this is a long-term commitment and have made a commitment for 2 years to work with us as part of SPI, but also recognize that the work will continue beyond. And then 2, what we're looking for in cohort institutions is that there is commitment from institutional leadership to move this work forward. And those are really what we expect of colleges. But in terms of, why should a college participate, it really is a question for you all. Is your institution ready to engage in these conversations and move the needle in this way? And that's something that an institution has to answer. One example that I'll share, a college that was impacted by the hurricane, that's an example where if it were any other time, they would have wanted to participate in this first cohort. Given the recovery process, the timing isn't right for them. So I think it really is incumbent upon institutional leaders to have these conversations, because we're ready to serve as part of the Student Success Center, but we also want to make sure that the institutions think that they're ready to start this process. I'll pause for any additional questions that might come in. Great. So when you close out the survey, you'll be prompted with a one-question survey just for us to get a general sense of where your institutions are and thinking about joining the cohort. We encourage you to download the handouts. So again, we have a copy of today's webinar. We have the actual Word document application as well as a two-pager that you can share within your institution just to refer to. We are also going to be emailing all of those materials out to participants along with a link to our YouTube channel where this webinar will be available to stream. As you have questions, please reach out to Abby Ivy, to Katura Young, or to me, Carrie Henderson, and we'll be happy to walk you through this process. We are really, truly excited about the opportunity that we think this presents for Florida and excited to work with you all in this really important endeavor. So thank you for your interest, and we look forward to connecting soon.